Hi guys, welcome to another show on the No Beef podcast. I'm here today with a special guest. Today I'm not going to introduce the guest, I'm going to allow the guest to introduce himself. So please take it away.
Okay, I'm Graham Campbell. I am a Glasgow City Councillor for the last 3 years, but I had a life before that. I'm a musician by trade, so I just was recently elected to the Scotland and Northern Ireland regional, shouldn't be called regional, should be called National Committee of the Musicians Union. So I've been a Musicians Union activist again for the last 2 years, but originally got involved back in the 1980s. And I was involved in bands then trying to stop pay to play, which is the infamous system of trying to get bands to pay venues to do stuff. So we helped set up a network of bands and a network of venues that paid fairly. So I did that in the late 80s, and in the early 90s I was involved in the movement here, partly in Scotland. That was when I first got involved in Scotland, which was around the Scottish Defiance Alliance for the Criminal Justice Bill back in 1993. I lived here for a while in, say, late 90s, and then came here permanently in 2002.
Thank you for that. I hope everyone got that. To me, it's monumental how you are the first Black African Caribbean councillor for Glasgow, and I've done a little bit of research on you, and I'm all for you, to be honest. I'm not aware if many Black people are aware of yourself and of the position you have, and I'm happy today to have you on the podcast because I feel that people are going to listen and acknowledge, and I hope that going forward they're going to learn, and maybe you are going to motivate young Black males, young Black females to go into politics or to be a councillor. My first question that I want to ask you is, living in Scotland, how have you found that being a Black man?
Or you could do a program just on that question. Okay, let's have the short version. The short version says this: is that thank you. I will have a coffee. Thank you. I would say this. I grew up in London. I was born in Islington, and the last time I lived in London, probably my home area in London is Peckham, Elephant Castle. That area is part of.
Oh, I know Elephant Castle. I grew up a little bit as well.
Right, so that's my home territory really for London. So I know Jeremy Corbyn. He was my MP. My mum introduced me to him 30 years ago. And so she was a very staunch Labour supporter. My dad, they're not together, but he was in Tottenham. And so he's still there in Tottenham.
Okay.
So those two communities are really well known to me. So all the Black people community runnings that happened in those areas, I'm personally connected to. I've lived in Brixton before, so that's a community I know pretty well. So I'm of that generation who had to fight our way through this. When we were migrants in the 70s, I remember growing up passing National Front newspaper sellers at the vegetable market. I remember the Silver Jubilee year, 1977, which was an awful year for the uprising of British extreme nationalism. Enoch Powell's influence was at its height, and he was the one who basically said send them back. And he would say, they would say keep Britain white, and we would say disembowel Enoch Powell. So that was how we experienced life, and we had to fight our way out of it. I got in trouble loads of times in primary school and then later on in school because of fights in playgrounds. So it was something we had to contend with every day to fight for our place to be there. Once I worked out that West Indian kids were a bit hard, they left us alone a bit. So being a West Indian, I'm Jamaican and Grenadian. My dad's Jamaican, my mum's Grenadian.
Okay.
Small island. Yeah?
Nice mix.
But very early on, we had to experience racism within our family. So it was, as a lot of Caribbean families, because we have a plantation society origins. Plantation societies where the white people at the top owning the land, and then the slightly brown-skinned people might own land but might run businesses and dominate the education section. And then there's the Black majority, which is 90% of the people which are disempowered economically. That's the structure, the apartheid structure the British left us. And we still have that written through our families. So I have family members who are from the slave backgrounds, family members who are from the aristocratic landholding backgrounds. And that was brought to the fore to me in 1983 when I found out about the Grenada Revolution. Between 1979 and 1983, a socialist revolution happened in Grenada, led by my mum's cousin, Morris Bishop. And I only really found out about it after he'd been overthrown and it died. The Americans eventually invaded the country and overthrew the revolution properly, but there was a problem inside the regime. He was overthrown by his deputy, and that was when I found out that, wow, that man your relative. But, you kind of have to then do the research. And the reason why I haven't been told is because my family members were the landowning side of this family who lost their land in the revolution. So my grandpa then got his land back, and I went and met him for the first time properly. And I had to farm with him for a year and then deal with his deep racism. And he was born in Ireland. He was half white, half black, but he was very light skinned. So he and all his children, all my aunts and uncles, all very light skinned. So you only know the West Indian by their speaking. So they were past white people and very proud of their being British and English and stuff. And I wasn't. And him having to deal with me as his helper on the farm, that was an interesting culture clash. Eventually, I think he grew to respect me because he knew I wasn't going to take any shit from him. But I had to sort of obviously learn a bit about what Caribbean life was like, and that was important for me to ground me in my sense of being a Dread. I've been a Dread since early days, since probably '81, but really through reggae music, through the Jamaican side of my connection, and then really I've probably more identified with the Jamaicans. But I've always thought myself, I'm not English. I was not English in my house. I was not English when I was with my relatives. I just happened to be in London. But we were a Caribbean family who happened to be located in London. So I never felt I was English, never. And therefore, it's not been too much of a stretch for me when I've come to Scotland to think, well, actually, I'm not Scottish, but I can relate to Scottish people's feeling of why they want to be a nation. So that I get that, because why wouldn't you choose to be independent? Because even though the two countries that I'm closely linked with, Jamaica and Grenada, are small island countries with independence, they have become culturally very powerful, especially Jamaica. Could you imagine Jamaica ever having the cultural impact that it has without independence? So I get all of that. But I've come to learn as I've been here that just how Scottish my family connection is, because I didn't know this until fairly recently. But my dad, when he first came to London to work in the late 50s, early 60s, he came at the same time as a lot of Scots migrants. And he himself knew of his own Scottish connection because his own grandfather was born in Scotland. And in fact, read him burn. Well, in fact, no, not read him burn the poems. He was forced on a Sunday to go and visit his grandpa on the land that he owned and read Burns to him. My dad and my dad's brother, Uncle Carl, were made to do that as kids from Sunday school. They used to go and get collected in a horse and car or a car, have to dress up in their suit, and then he would make them read the Bible, Robert Burns or Shakespeare to him. So I had no idea about that until fairly recently. So my family is very Scottish, as a lot of Jamaican families are. And that connection isn't really well known enough. So I have a vested interest in telling the stories I've been telling around the slavery connection and so on. I haven't quite gone as far as invested all of it, because I think if I do, there's going to be things I really don't like.
And when you say that, like you said, you've had slavery connections in your family, some of the information that you might find is going to be very saddening,
Yes.
Talking about the slavery and so on, and obviously your time in London, and obviously your time now in Edinburgh and Glasgow, now to present day, on a racism scope, do you think anything has changed?
I have to say that my experience of coming here during the 90s, when there was hardly any black people, was that there was a novelty factor, especially if you got lost, right? First of all, people already have an identification with Bob Marley, that they can put you in that box.
Yeah.
And sadly, every other day, maybe in Glasgow, people who don't know who I am or whatever, they will say, "Oh, look at that, it's Bob Marley," and they say it under their breath as if they have I've never heard it before. And they try to take the piss out of me. Now, if I had got time, I will confront them. I say, well, you're being racist. Fuck off.
Yeah.
But if I haven't got time, if I had to stop every time that happens, and it will happen at least a couple of times when I'm in the city centre in Glasgow. Strangely, it never happens in Edinburgh. I've not had it happen to me in Edinburgh, which is weird. You'd have thought
that's very
fewer
very
black
true.
people in Edinburgh, but more dreads in Glasgow. But it happens to me all the time in Glasgow. It never happens to me anywhere else. So that does sadden me. And it is racist, but people probably don't think they're being racist. That's the other thing.
Yeah,
They think, oh, I recognise you, I can look at you, I know what you're about, because, oh yeah, sure, you probably talk a bit about, and I don't, Rastas don't. It's not a thing that, real Rastas don't necessarily have to use we, but it annoys me that perception is there, that they think that's what it's going to be. It's wrong, but it's a stereotype.
So, when you compare it to Edinburgh, do you think, when you compare Glasgow and Edinburgh, do you think that it's because Edinburgh was more multicultural? Because you did say that Glasgow did have more dreads there. So what do you put that to? Do you think Edinburgh were more sociably aware of...
No, I wouldn't say that, no. I'll be blunt with you, probably. Edinburgh's a
I want
less
you to be,
friendly place
please.
than Glasgow is. And I will say that every time. Glaswegians, by and large, my experience of being here has been people like to point out your differences.
Yeah.
In a way, they kind of poke you just to check how you react. And if you react and you stand up for yourself, they respect that. And that's how I've always dealt with people.
Yeah.
So whether it's been in pubs or whatever, so what's all that here about, Paul? And they give you that. What's that about? And then you give them an honest chat back. If you can do banter, then you stand up for yourself. People respect you, and that's what I've always done. And I've always found people will accept me.
Does that become mentally draining sometimes, though? Surely, because for me, when I talk about racism, Councillor, it's like a trauma for me. It's like a trigger, And when as growing up in Edinburgh and in Glasgow, I felt that anytime something happened, I had a certain rage, There are platforms, there are times where in certain circumstances, I can't do anything, I just have to either leave the restaurant, leave the social event. But on football parks, I'd stand up for myself. I'm not going to let you intimidate me. And I feel like I can't fight everyone, So I'm very guilty of it. Sometimes you just get on with it. You just accept it. And have you ever felt that once an incident has happened, you went home mentally and not doubt yourself, but think, wow, do they really, really hate us that much?
I've always I've been I'll start again. I've been around long enough to have seen at least 3 waves of racism and anti-racism in reaction to it, right? So I was there in the 70s one and the 80s one. I was there in the 90s one around Stephen Lawrence, and I've been here in this one, right? Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to be able to historically compare the 3, but there's no doubt that the majority of people in Scotland are less racist than they were before. They're more internationalist, more outgoing, right?
That's a very bold statement, Councillor, would you not say?
It's important to say this, though. You have to caveat it this way. The social attitude surveys show you that, but the majority also are slightly more Islamophobic than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But the minority that's racist is more vocally racist. And I think what's happening to us is that minority is making its presence felt because it's been allowed to make its presence felt by the political events that have happened, particularly the obsession with immigration and asylum detention and the negative stuff around that. And obviously a large amount of our community, the African community, comes from a refugee background, right? So there's the demonizing of them. Then there's the demonizing of Muslims, so half of the African community is Muslim. So of course we're affected by Islamophobia. So inevitably we're seen as, and then that's after we've already been stereotyped for hundreds of years as violent resistors of colonial oppression, and therefore threats to white man's women and liberty. They see our physical bodies as a threat to them. which is why they police us in the way they've done. Now, historically, I have to say, the stats bear this out, that while we have racism with police experiences in here, and I've pretty much most of the people I've known who are from BME community who have a motor car have been stopped by police more than they should have been, right?
That's very
been stopped by British transport police at train stations much more than should have been, stopped by them at airports much more than they should have been. So that's a factor, but we don't have the degree of death that happens at police custody that they have in England. That's a blessing, but it's not a grounds for complacency, because the thoughts that officers are thinking with, which is what the Sheku Bayard case shows us, is that we're quite capable of one, racist homicide, two, having a system of oppression in terms of the way that the police and the courts and the justice system fails to deal with it.
Yeah.
We've got institutionalized racism. And the difference, I suppose, for here is that Scots like to think of themselves as immune to these things. From both the unionist and nationalist perspectives. The unionists will say, look, we're the great people who led the abolitionist movement, and aren't we wonderful because we abolished slavery and, you know, we abolished that sort of thing in the empire. Well, one, you have an empire. Two, that you practiced slavery for 250 years and the wealth extracted from that created Edinburgh and Glasgow, and you don't acknowledge it. But three, on the other side of it is this other identity which says, oh, well, we're only poor little Scotland. We were oppressed by the English and we had nothing to do with all that oppression stuff. That was English. It wasn't. Scots did it, and the Scots were overrepresented in the empire's dealings with African people. In the enslavement of us, they were overrepresented. They were overrepresented in the slavery compensations. Scotland's about 10% of the country in the UK, whereas we were 15% of the slave compensation payees. And that's the ones in Scotland. We're not counting the Scots who were in Liverpool and Bristol. 5 top slave trading firms in Liverpool were owned by Scots. One of them was William Gladstone's dad. And we've got a big statue to him. So the statue is important, but we need to locate it within the context of an overall history of institutionalized racism, which we've unacknowledged. And it's all part of the fact that we're an unacknowledged, still an empire. So it's not a surprise that within that retained empire, that the citizens who think of themselves as citizens of it have a perception of white supremacy in their heads, which influences how they act towards us. Because I'm sure you've experienced it, but you come from an African country which has been independent for a good long time, which has its own history and culture and history from before slavery. Do any Scots people know any of that? No, of course they don't. They think of Africa. The moment they think of Africa, they think, one, it's one single country. The other thing they think about it, they think poverty, trees, oh, I'm going to donate to water aid and stop, donate to sites. They think of us in aid terms. They don't think of us as modern consumers who live a daily life the same as they do on iPhones and social media, going shopping in malls, which is what the majority of Africans who live in cities, that's what they do as well.
Exactly.
They also have motor cars, but they don't have that perception of us. Where do they get that negative stuff from? It's because they have a history of racism and white supremacy. So that's what we're fighting. We're fighting a system that has 450 years of shaping the brains of the people in this country in this way. It's hard. Of course, it's tiring for us to have to deal with all of that in our dealings with an individual. Because if you wanted to have the time to sort that out, you can't fight every single battle when you're here in ignorance like that.
Yeah,
otherwise you'll be exhausted.
What I'm gonna ask you now, on the base of that, on the back of that, why do you think in our secondary schools in Scotland or England, the UK, why is it not taught?
It's not taught because the truth, they want to present the country in a good light. Well, that's true of the UK or Scotland. Of course they want to present the heroes and sheroes of British or Scottish nationalism. Of course they're going to do that. The trouble is that we're not the good guys, we're the bad guys. And when your country's the bad guys, and you to construct a narrative about your country, you have to lie about it.
Yeah.
So you have to brainwash your people to believe that you were really good guys. So you say you were abolitionists rather than you were slave masters. Okay, the abolitionists were great people, but the abolitionists had their day for it took them maybe 30 or 50 years to properly abolish slavery. But that 50 years is then used to ignore the 250 years that preceded that. Think how the impact that 12 years in Nazi Germany has had still 70 years later. 70 years later, we're talking about definitions of anti-Semitism and anti-racism stemming and compensation packages, stemming from the Holocaust that lasted for just 12 years. In 12 years, 2/3 of the European Jews were murdered systematically in a genocide. Think of the cultural impact, the social, political, and legal impact that 12 years has had. What do you think a period of 250 years involving a minimum of 13 million Africans dead, plus all the ones who were forcibly transported, and the long-term negative impact on the West African economies and peoples of the loss of all of their brightest, best, fittest young people for a period of 250 years. Imagine, we know what the Highland clearances did for the people in the Highlands, right? Diluting it of population. Well, that happened to West Africa for 250 years. And that our people are in the Caribbean, in these offshore African islands, as I call them. That's what Jamaica is. It's an offshore African island, just 3,000 miles offshore, that's all. But we are there because Scots and British people were perpetrating this evil triangular trade to develop their wealth and their system. So that's not been rectified. Nobody's owned up to that. And until these countries own up to it, we can't have an honest conversation about racism, because everything they think about white supremacy and racism comes from that period. That's why acknowledging this history is so difficult for the country, because to acknowledge that, you'd have to admit that you're perpetrators, for one thing, that white supremacy and racism comes partly from Scotland, that so much of the Enlightenment rationalist thinkers that we think about as brilliant, that we got statues to, people like David Hume and all of that. Well, David Hume wrote an appalling piece of crap called The Occasional Discourse on an N-Word, where he describes the ability of a Jamaican African, I can't remember if it was a freed slave or not, but a man who had been enslaved. And his ability to actually read, write, and think rationally as any other person was calculated as, you can teach a monkey to do things. That's how Hume, supposed rationalist philosopher, wrote about black people, that you could train them as if you're training an animal. That's what he thought. And that's meant to be this country's greatest thinker. There's no acknowledgement that racism is at the heart of the country's self-image of itself. And that's what's difficult about it. Of course it's difficult. And I know how that feels because I've got slave-owning family members in my history.
So obviously you can relate to that on a more high level than me. And going there, so Councillor, why do you think our history is not taught in the schools of the UK?
It's pretty clear that the UK as a whole, and of course Scotland within that, has two competing mythical narratives to compete with when telling the story. Because first of all, they have to tell the story that they're not the good guys. They're the bad guys. They're the main bad guys in this international story. And Scots have a differential position with this because, of course, we do get taught about the Atlantic slave trade in school. It has been the case for 20 or more years that you do in Scotland, certainly since 2004, you do get taught this transatlantic slave trade in school. The trouble is that after about 13, 14, when you're choosing a subject, you don't really get any more history after that. The other problem we have is it only tells you about the slave trade up until 1807 and abolition. It doesn't tell you what happened to slavery after that, and it doesn't deal with Glasgow and Edinburgh's major perpetrating role. So we don't get a sense that Scotland's directly involved in the slave trade in a major way. And in fact, we're overrepresented within British slavery, and that Scotland indeed became part of the union with Britain in England because of the failure of the Scots to establish their own plantation slavery economy in what's now Panama, Darien, as they call it. That bankrupted the country because 2,000 people died in the attempt, and it failed mainly because the Spanish and the English made sure they didn't succeed. They lost out to their power. So the only way that Scots merchants could get hold of the riches and rewards of the triangular transatlantic slave trade was to come in with the English. So that was the major motivation for them to create the Union State in the first place. And of course, the majority of the people in Scotland were against it, but of course, the majority of the rich were totally in favour of it. You know why? Yeah. Article 4 of the Union Treaty was a bailout for the speculative capitalists who lost their money in the Darien experiment. So slavery has a crucial, central role in the creation of the wealth of the country, and indeed of the creation of the nation state that we're part of. Of course, they don't want to acknowledge that, because to acknowledge that would be to say, not only is your history falsified, you're not legitimate actually as a country, as a state. And that Scotland's thoughts about itself and about what it is to the world, how it perceives itself in the world, is just not true. We're not the harbingers of freedom, equality, enlightenment, and rationalism. We're actually the harbingers of scientific, institutionalized racism, white supremacy. Yeah. In the philosophies of people like David Hume, one of our biggest enlightenment rational philosophers, who's got a big statue to him in the middle of Edinburgh. But that guy was a racist, as he said in the occasional discourse on an N-word. You know, so his view about black people was that they were inferior to white people. That's not very rationalist or enlightened, and that's our main thinking. Of course, there were people who opposed it, but even the people who opposed it, liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill and so on, wrote a really good counter to him, but they didn't make up for the fact that they still did business with these people. Those people still paid for the academic institutions like Edinburgh and Glasgow universities to thrive. Their slavery bequests from their ill-gotten gains paid for the graduation of all these clerks, accountants, ship surgeons, doctors, and every kind of profession that you require to run an empire. Scots were majorly involved in that empire because they had this high level of education. They misused it to perpetrate slavery and imperialism. So this is why they don't tell you that history, because to tell the truth about that would be deeply upsetting, obviously to the establishment, but it would be upsetting to the population, because their own sense of who they are and what they are in the world would be deeply disturbed.
So from that, okay, it's not taught. Do you understand, or do you think people that are against Black Lives Matter, are against the statues being removed, do you think these people, I'm not going to say a minority, because I don't think it is a minority. I think there is a widespread of people who are against these statues coming down. But if they listen to this podcast, if they just listen to what you've just said there, do you think that with an open mind, they'd hopefully change their views, their mentality, way of thinking towards helping Black Lives Matter, towards being woke, towards being actually acknowledging that the heritage of their families, their ancestors were. Okay. Carry on.
Yeah, there's two. I'm hesitant to answer that because I don't really want to perpetuate the statue debate, because frankly, the statue debate is getting in the way of the real debate we should be having about actual Black Lives Matter, because people should ask themselves, the first question is, why are they so exercised about a bit of stone and a bit of bronze on a plinth, more than they are bothered about the deaths of black people in police custody, particularly the one in this country that was most notorious, which is Sheku Bayo's death in custody? Where were they protesting about that? Where were they writing their letters to their MPs and MSPs about that? Because if they don't give a damn about black people's lives, they're not getting it. If they're engaging in this discussion only about the bloody statues, they're missing the point entirely.
I'm glad you said that, because I agree with you, Councillor, because I feel that the statues, it's a bit of stone to me, the way I see it. If they come down brilliant. If they don't, it happens, you know. If you want to put them in a museum, these people that say it's part of history are the same people that probably wouldn't even visit a museum, or when they go to other countries probably don't even go on tours or anything to see the history of the country they're visiting. But I do agree with you, it is a distraction, because I fear the fact that Black Lives Matter is being brought to the front, people are finding a distraction to moan about. It's like they're pushing the matter to the side and dealing with little annoying, critical things that right now is not the important situation at hand.
I wouldn't say it's not important. You have to locate it with its proper sense of importance.
Okay.
First of all, you have to say that, of course, Edinburgh and Glasgow in particular, we know those two cities best, right, for you and me, but
Yeah.
I'm sure it applies to towns all across Scotland. We all have town centres, city centres, which have been designed in an era of colonialism and imperialism. They were designed by the great white men who made the wealth, so-called, off our backs, and have not acknowledged that in the way they built the cities. Of course, they have named streets after themselves. Of course, they built great public buildings after themselves. Of course, they built great private mansions to themselves. Of course, they improved private country estates off the back of this wealth.
Yeah.
Of course, so the city, of course, designed and ministered by them, of course, has put monuments up to glorify them. Now, the truth is that most of the statues we've got have been put up by public subscription. That means that citizens have raised little bits of money of all wealth and all stratas to put up monuments to people they felt was important. Of course, they were the citizens of an empire, so they thought, or subjects of an empire. So they thought of that kind of level of greatness. So of course, they designed the city centre to reflect that thinking, that worldview.
Yeah.
Of course, it completely conflicts with the thinking and worldview that most of us have now. So the thing I would say to people is, look, well, think of what your worldview is now, your perception of what you think Edinburgh or Glasgow is. Most people say it's a cosmopolitan, international city with a great diversity of culture, and we are very proud, and we love that thing about it. Well, what? And then we have to ask, well, does your cityscape, your sort of theme park that visitors visit, does that reflect that reality in the statues, monuments that you have on your streets, or who they're named after, and indeed whole districts? Like we've got the Merchant City. Why is it named after them?
Yeah.
When those merchants are merchants of slavery, so I would question the very fact that names and statues are important, but people have to understand why there is a necessity to review it. Just to remove the evidence or remove the stuff without that explanation and public awareness and discussion and education process would be a lost opportunity, because you lose the opportunity to challenge the white supremacy behind that, and therefore link it to the racism of yesterday to the racism of now. You lose that chance to have a proper public engagement. But then the other question about that is that for people to not be upset about it, they have to then have a sort of engaged process of deciding what replaces it. So who would you name it after instead, in other words? Who people do you want to venerate? So one example we have in Glasgow, of course, is that, well, in fact, two. We have a recent statue to Mary Barber, the rent strike activist from 1915. So there's a statue of her in Govan where she was organising. So she's the first woman to have a proper, apart from Queen Victoria, to have a proper public statue in Glasgow. There's La Passionara, of course. I forgot about her on the Clyde side. So that's the Spanish Civil War fighter. So that's recognised. So there's only two women now who've got a statue. But we've got Nelson Mandela coming. Nelson Mandela's statue is coming to Nelson Mandela Place in George Square. And that's part of the history of us as an anti-apartheid city, actively showing our solidarity with South Africa by actually renaming the place where the South African consulate was, and they had to get their mail with Nelson Mandela Place written on it, and they therefore didn't get their mail for 2 years. And eventually they closed down. That's why that square is named Nelson Mandela Place. We were the first city to give him the freedom of the city as well. First internationally to do that, and hundreds of cities followed suit. So that place has an importance. That's why it's right that a statue is there. And that's done by public subscription. They've raised about half the money they need. So the citizens of now are making a statement about what statues should be up. And that's right that the citizens should do that. So we have a process that could do that. So I'm arguing for the council to have a proper public consultation on these things. So it's not that the statue stuff is not important, but it needs to say something about the anti-racism journey that the citizens are going on now. That's a publicly engaged discussion. It's not something I can just do. Because frankly, as you say, all the statues and all the street names could be changed tomorrow overnight, but institutionalized racism would still be
there. Yeah, that's it. That's right. So when I say, I 100% agree. And when I say importance, I mean, they've got to prioritize, and then they have to see why that this is still a problem. Regarding the anti-racism, I don't know how you are in sports and so on, but in sports, few footballers have been abused, saying all lives matter, hashtag all lives matter, hashtag white lives matter. Have you came across anyone that has verbally or even on social media given you that kind of abuse where to say it's not just black people, there's white people, all lives matter, white lives matter. What's your stance or what is your response to that when people do say stuff like that?
Obviously, it's a daft and defensive response. But you have to break it down into the components. Obviously, when people say that, if they're well-meaning people, what they actually mean is all lives should matter. And I personally value lives equally, and I don't want to, and I don't discriminate. That's what they're saying. They're trying to make an anti-racist statement, some of them. I don't believe that most of them who say that are just, there's an exception of those apologists for police violence.
Yeah.
Who have a blue lives matter stripe on their Union Jack. Those people are different. But most people who say that are naively not understanding the experience of black people. So that can be solved. You can engage in a discussion about that. And the simple way of saying it is, well, of course all lives should matter, but right now we're talking about black lives because they currently don't matter, as is proved by the way that we're policed so differently to white people. And the stats show that. There's the evidence to show that. Plus the actual experiences of black people. You actually listen to them, they tell you that this place is much more racist than you think it is because we experience the racism, you don't.
With that, I've explained this to so many people, and I hope the people that are listening and watching this do get it. And I still don't understand why non-black people are angry when a black male says Black Lives Matter. I don't understand why it's debated or why they feel the need to be so defending on all lives matter. Oh, yeah, of course all lives matter. I agree with that. Of course all lives matter. But however, I don't see people of your colour being harassed, being murdered, being prejudiced against, being negatively targeted in all aspects. So right now we are in a movement where it says Black Lives Matter. Do you think the people that do say this, do you think they are aware of history? Or do you think it's just an automatic human response to Black Lives Matter?
It's a classic example of what our American cousins call white fragility. And it's that fragility, white fragility, which basically is the defensive response to the possible accusation that you might even possibly be partly responsible for racism in some way or shape or form. And it's that defensive reaction. I don't know if you saw the Stephen Lawrence documentary. It's been repeated recently, but there's a 3-part documentary. And if you look at the final part where they're talking about the Lawrence inquiry itself, you look at the defensive reaction of the then police commissioner, Paul Condon.
Okay.
He was a complete idiot, but his classic brickbat defense, we're not racist, look at all the things we're doing to stop racism. He absolutely rejected straight on any possibility that the police
Could be
were
corrupt.
institutionally racist. He just rejected it out of hand, but then had to just swallow it and take it up when the judge said, yes, you are. A white privileged judge had to say it. Yes, you are. And this is my thick report telling you so. That thick report led to the equalities laws that we've got now, which talk about processes, procedures, mechanisms, etc., about how organizations and structures create racial discriminatory outcomes. He pointed that out in that report. Condon had to swallow it up. But that classic white fragility was that he just couldn't acknowledge that he was part of the perpetrating problem. He said, oh, I've got to stay on, not resign as police commissioner so that I can institute the changes. No, well, you've been instituted. The guy was in charge of the police force when that atrocity against Stephen Lawrence and his family happened. And those police were shown to be negligent and incompetent because of the way they responded to a black victim of crime as perpetrators. Essentially, they treated the witness, the main witness was demonized, the family were demonized, the family were spied on by the police under a surveillance watch instead of being supported. You know, this is what happened to them. It's what happened to the Bio family here in Scotland. So this is a current problem. So if that's white fragility expressed in police terms, think about it with all the other institutions. So citizens don't want to acknowledge, and particularly in football, I'm involved partly in football because I set up a football league called the Andrew Watson Memorial Football League.
Oh, wow. I never knew that.
We started that about 3-4 years ago. It's not functioning now because we had some issues with the charitable registered status. But essentially, we set up a league to remember Andrew Watson because exactly that. Most people in football don't know that we had black internationals in the 1890s. You know, the
oh, wow.
first international black captain, Andrew Watson, played for the gentlemen clubs of his day, which was Queen's Park, Corinthians. He played in the Scottish FA Cup. He's played in the English FA Cup. He captained the side twice for Scotland against England and won both times. You know, we could do with him now because, frankly, Scotland needs the help. But that boy was born in Guyana. So he was a black international football captain, player, international cup winner. He ended up being the club secretary for Queen's Park, which was the main gentleman's club of the day. So he was a major international figure in international football history, yet we don't have a proper memory of him in Scottish football. And given that we go back so far, we should be more intolerant of racism on our pitches. But I actually, 10 years ago now, I had to get a gathering of African and Caribbean and Asian footballers together to go and meet the SFA and to say to them, look, this is our daily experience of racism on the pitches. And we find that referees, coaches, people in leadership positions are not taking action on the pitch when they see it, and we're not represented in the coaching or in the leadership of clubs. We're not there. We're being systematically excluded. And the SFA then put a bit of a programming together, and they have, to be fair to them, tried over the few years to work to try and address that. They had some football equity officers for a while, but and these days we have some work. They do some anti-racism programs with European football, but it's still a problem in the grassroots of clubs that we're just not represented at boardroom level, at management level. So the institution is deeply racist in the structure, but not necessarily in the players. You know, players are quite representative. We're right there in the playing staff. But again, even then, are we captains of the team? Are we vice captains? No.
And you know, regarding like sports and stuff, you know, from grassroots football, I remember playing for a team called Arniston when I was younger, and I was the only black person on the park. And do you know, I got fouls against me. I was using my strength or my ability to win the football. The referee kept giving me, calling fouls against me. And you know, my whole team were just like, what are you talking about? What are you doing? But I knew what was going on. And I actually said to him, I was like, are you going to keep calling a foul against me? And he said to me, you know what you are. Not, you know what you're doing, or just get on with the game. You know what you are. And for me, I was thinking, you're the man with authority right now on this park. If someone kicks my leg, I come to you to say, hey, ref, you know, what about that? Do you know, like, it put me off. I was like, well, I don't really want to play football because I'm not just getting picked on by the players, but the referee, I won't name his name, the referee actually knew, he said that to me. I was thinking, wow, I know what I am. I don't want to be like, well, what am I? But I knew what he was referring to. Luckily, I just channeled my rage and we won the game, and he couldn't say anything after that. But when you're saying representation, we're not represented. I don't see any black referees. I don't see any black coaches. Yes, we have black football players. But do you know, there's only, I think I've met one black coach, was a friend of mine, and he stopped because he couldn't get anyone to give him experience. They were happy for him to come and play and train, but they wouldn't give him the platform to coach. Now, he's a very, very good football player, but they won't allow him to coach, but they were happy for him to play. you know, when you play football for so long, you know, when you get to a certain age, there's no point trying to go do your coaching badges. There's no point trying to be a referee. The SFA have to encourage this. However, words are just words. Actions speak louder than words. You know, go and recruit. Go to these clubs and say to these black players in the academies or grassroots football, junior football, East of Scotland football, what are you going to do after you finish playing football? Do you want to remain in football in some capacity? Do you know there's these channels that we look to encourage people, not black people, people, okay? Then actually, do you know what? We need to create a diversity. Have you ever thought about coming to do this? You know? And I still haven't had that. I'm 30 years old, still haven't had that. And
Well, I need to put you in touch with some people then. The SFA, to be fair to them, have been doing this quite well, actually, certainly in the west of Scotland, and to some extent in Edinburgh. I understand they do this as well. But they've had programs precisely to get to people, to get them their SFA coaching qualifications and refereeing qualifications. I've myself been on one of those.
okay.
And, years ago now, but you know, I went for the refereeing, beginnings of the refereeing course. So I know they do encourage people to do it, and have some specifically aimed at BAME community training available. So they are doing that. Whether people know about it, that's another thing. But they've done surveys of black parents, and some of the obstacles that parents tell them that they're coming across is obviously their worry about security, safety, exposing their kids to racist chants and behaviours on the pitch. That sort of stuff is quite frowned on by the SFA. The trouble is that the ability to act on it is dependent on how the amateur leagues work. And so they've done a lot of training development for referees, you know, so qualities training for referees. They do that as part of their courses, as a central part of it. The stuff they're doing with football, it's called Football Against Racism in Europe, FAIR. That's a program that they do. That's for aimed at getting refugee integration into the game. So they're really quite good at that. But the reality is, from a black player and club point of view, we've had to form our own clubs. And for the last 15 years, the Scottish Unity League has existed in the west of Scotland. And that's, you know, Afro Scots United, other African-led football teams. There's been Glasgow Afghan United is in that. So refugee groups, communities have formed their own teams and had to have their own league for many years because being in other people's leagues exposed us to problems.
Yeah. From sports to politics to schools, social events. You were talking about music earlier. How was your experience of that with racism? Did you find that you had a mixed group? Did you find that white people were asking you, "Oh, what's this? Let me listen to it"? Did you have that mix of that where white people or non-black people, non-Caribbean people would come in and ask you to talk to you about music?
Do you know what? Never asked me to talk about music. No, they always want to impress me with their knowledge of music better than I have. You know, so plenty of white Glaswegians who know their reggae scene much better than I do. Actually, they have a more encyclopedic knowledge and have more time than I have available to listen to as much music as they do. So I find that the old school reggae stuff that I like, there's a lot of people who like ska, reggae, rocksteady, dub. All of that is very popular. What's not so well known is the current Jamaican music scene, and whether that's put out there. You know, there's a sort of very oldies kind of scene. So yeah, there's lots of people who want to impress themselves with your kind of music, but I've always had a problem with trying to put bands together in this city because finding a drummer that can do syncopated beats.
Okay.
Anything vaguely Caribbean or African, which is a slight offbeat with a bit of jazz contemporary.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to teach rock and roll, 4-stroke, bum, bum, bum drummers. Really difficult. And as I can't drum, that makes it really difficult. Now, generally speaking, people are very open and flexible in their music choices and culture. So I can't really say I've suffered discrimination in that respect because there's a respect for reggae in the city. But there is a marginalization and stereotyping. So, you know, I know black people who are involved in rock and roll, in hard rock scenes, in classical music. And it's particularly difficult for my brothers and sisters who are in the classical music business to get are properly involved in orchestras and stuff. The orchestras are so not representative of the black
Oh
classical
yeah, 100%.
so there's definitely different departments of the business which are white dominated in a way they shouldn't be, especially jazz. Given that jazz is an African American art form, there should be
Which we
more black
started.
people involved in leading jazz.
Yeah.
You know, but to get into the jazz scene, you have to smooth with the type of people that bore the shit out of me, to be honest.
Yeah.
And if you have to go through that to be part of the scene, then you don't bother. If you really care about your music, then you just craft your music. And
Exactly.
frankly, because you're able to get to an audience that's not mediated by those people anymore in the same way as it was, you can get around it more easily now than you used to be able to with technology.
Okay. Well, my final question is a question to you, obviously, is that, do you have any questions for me?
Yes, for your generation. Obviously, my generation's gone through some experiences, right? I'm 53, so I've been politically active for 30 years. I've always had a sort of race, class, and gender perspective to the political activism that I've been involved in. So I've been in efforts for the left to organise in Scotland before, and I'm in the SNP now, so I've kind of tried my best within that structure to try and shift things in a progressive direction. But from your perspective, you've grown up in Scotland. That's the disadvantage I have. I haven't grown up here in the same way. So I've probably come into my own being here, so I've certainly grown as a character and as a person.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing things here in this country I probably wouldn't be doing if I lived somewhere else. So
Yeah.
It's definitely changed my life in a good way, in many good ways. But seeing your future ahead, you've got children, I take it. So
Yes,
do you worry for them
Yeah.
about how they are going to experience racism when you're growing up? I mean, I know that I thought of this when I was your age, and I thought, well, I'm determined to stop it happening before my children might grow up. And the sad truth is that some of these institutions may still be around when your kids are growing up into adulthood. Is that something that worries you? And
I think well, my wife is half Algerian. She's North African and half Scottish. So our son's mixed. He's a mix of Nigeria, Scotland, and Algeria. And it does worry me because when I was growing up, my parents sheltered me a lot. I didn't go out as much. I just played football. I didn't go to any area where my mum and dad couldn't see where I was. I went to church every Sunday, Sunday school every Sunday. It was very rigid. Football, I missed out on a lot of opportunities for football because playing for certain teams meant missing church. And my parents weren't really modern. And yes, I can say I'm angry at them, but I can see why they weren't, because they grew up in London. They seen the racism. They didn't want me to be exposed. But then I feel like they did shelter me because that means I'm in a bubble, So when I did get racially profiled, I was like, wow, really? Does this actually happen? Because in London, I grew up in southeast London, Waterloo. That was my area. So there was black people everywhere, Jamaicans everywhere, So, I mean, the small minority was the white person, For me, I'm worried because I want my son to be able to go and do anything, whether to go do music, play football, swim, whatever, study. But I'm also not naive to know that because of the colour of his skin, some of the opportunities will not come forth or might just dissolve because of the colour of skin. And, there's going to come a time where I have to sit down with him and say, look, I encourage you to do this, but be mindful that this might be the potential outcome. And it kills me and it really hurts me because my parents had this conversation with me, and 2020, I'm having this conversation with you. Do you know what I mean? I'm having the conversation with you. I have the conversations with other people, and I probably will have this conversation in 10 years' time with my son. And what I want to do is create awareness so that he is not just up here street smart, but he's knowledgeable. and he has the confidence to enter any room, speak his mind, without having to tone himself down, having to make himself appreciated on the eye, you know. I also want him to be proud of who he is, you know. And we don't really talk much about that, pride and proud. It's normally seen that us black people, oh, they're very proud people in an arrogant way. No, because the way people sing "O Flower of Scotland" or "God Save the Queen," why can't I say I'm black and proud? You know, why do I have to tone my appearance, tone the way I talk? I'm just hopeful that the stuff that I can do now can prepare him mentally and physically. And I do pray that, I mean, I say this with my hand on my heart, that he won't have to have this kind of situation. But racism is just not verbally racism, it's systematic, you know. And still to this day, the education in schools, if that won't change, you know, my son's kids, their kids are probably going to still be taught the same curriculum. So until that happens, my son probably will. So it's up to me and my wife to prepare him mentally, physically, and encourage him and be ready for when that time does happen.
Well, do you know what? You hit some of the nails on the head there, because obviously there's things you as parents and the current Black Lives Matter movement can do, which are one of its main demands already that has emerged is changing the curriculum.
Yeah.
Decolonizing the curriculum. So that's something that can be done in the short term, which there's an election coming up next year. So all the political parties can be challenged to, well, what are you going to do to decolonize our curriculum?
Yeah.
Because that is a Scottish Parliament question. So we can change that. And we have the political power and authority as a newly emerged movement, a political moment of black arrival, which they now can't say that we don't exist anymore. They can't say, oh, there's no black people in Scotland. No, black Scottish people are there everywhere. So this is the moment of black Scottish political arrival where we must use our political clout to the maximum to change the things we can change in the short term. So I think you're going to have the conversation with your son. You're going to have the talk. The question is, do you have the system knowledge? And this is one of the things I think, pertaining to your background, is that many of us in the African Caribbean community, particularly the African community, because we are church-going and mosque-going, 95% of us go to church and mosque. That's the exact opposite of the majority population around us. So first of all, faith guides how we do stuff, but also the community that we have around faith, which is our support mechanisms for surviving racism in Scotland. That's really important to us. So of course, we're not going to shift for those things. So anybody who wants to work with us has to come to us almost. This annoying phrase I keep finding is, oh, we're hard to reach communities. We're not hard to reach. Everybody knows exactly where we are every Sunday and every Friday. We know exactly where to find us because the whole community is right there. So if you really give a shit about communicating with us, we're really easy to find. Problem is understanding why they don't approach us. Because I find this as well with experienced community activists. I did a bit of research on this last year. I established a focus group of African communities in my ward in Springburn, and I found that despite the fact that most of those Africans who were with me from Congo, Cameroon, Nigeria, you name it, all these countries, all of them had been here longer than I have, but none of them knew that the place where I was meeting them was organized by the community council. They didn't know what a community council was, despite the fact they were really well integrated, no problem with the language or cultural understanding. They just didn't know the system and
we're not told
how government is working. So that's leaders, that's activist leaders who are actively involved in organizing events, activities, sport, language support, mental health stuff, you name it. So even our leading activists were ignorant of this structure. So if that's what's happening in our structures, then our lack of system knowledge is holding us back in challenging the structures that discriminate against us. So I hope that by 10 years' time, we'll have a detailed system knowledge. We'll have our own representatives within that system, at all levels within it, from councillor downwards, and that we're working for these institutions and fighting inside them to change them. That they're no longer, we will walk into a place and there's only white people there. We have to, that has to stop. That's the things we could change in the short term and must do by the time your son is 10.
No beef between myself and Councillor Graham. Thank you for coming. And guys, that's another show concluded. Look out for the next podcast. Thank you very much.